Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're tearing into something that forms, well, literally the foundation of our world major construction contracts.
And not just any contracts. We're getting into the extremely structured world of FIDIC, that's the International Federation of Consulting Engineers. These are the rules for the biggest projects on the planet.
We're zeroing in on quality control. We've got clauses 7.1 through 7.8 from the 2017 FIDI contract, which is all about plant, materials, and workmanship.
Right. Our mission here is to basically distill the core rules of quality, inspection, and maybe most importantly, accountability. Who pays when things go wrong?
This is so much more than blueprints. It's a really strict legal dance between the contractor who's doing the building and the engineer who's kind of the quality cop for the employer.
Okay, let's unpack this. Where do we even start?
We start with the absolute baseline, clause 7.1, the manner of execution. This sets the quality floor, if you will.
It's the quality floor. I like that.
It says the work, and that's everything from manufacture to installation to testing, has to be done in one of two ways. And the first one sounds pretty simple. Just do exactly what the contract says. No wiggle room.
Precisely. The contract is king. But, and this is the crucial part, if the contract doesn't specify something.
Ah, a loophole.
Not at all.
Yeah.
There's no loophole. If it's not specified, the contractor has to default to executing the work in a proper, workmanlike, and careful manner. And it has to be according to recognized good practice.
So you can't just cut corners because a detail was missing in the specs.
You absolutely cannot. It's an explicit backstop to ensure quality, even with imperfect documents.
You know, something that really jumped out at me in that first clause is the mention of safety and environment. It says contractors have to use properly equipped facilities and non-hazardous materials.
Yeah, that's a critical safety net baked right into the definition of quality. The default is clean facilities and safe materials. Unless, and this is the only exception, the contract specifically says otherwise.
Which would be pretty rare, I imagine.
Very rare. It makes safety a non-negotiable part of quality from day one.
Okay, so the standard is set. Now you have to prove your components, the materials, actually meet that standard. I'm guessing I can't just, order a bunch of steel and start building.
Not a chance. That brings us to clause 7.2, which is all about samples. The key principle here is consent. You need the engineer's consent before you use the materials.
Build first, ask permission later is not an option.
Not even close. The contractor has to submit samples, either standard ones from the manufacturer or specific ones from the contract, and they pay for it.
And I saw a detail here that really speaks to the level of documentation needed.
The labeling.
Yeah, the labeling. Every sample has to be marked with its origin and intended use in the works.
Total traceability. That's the goal. If there's a failure 5 years down the line, they can trace that component right back to its source sample.
And if the engineer wants more samples, they can just ask for them as a variation.
Yep, the oversight is continuous.
So that brings us to the oversight itself. How does the engineer actually check things once construction is underway? This is where it gets really interesting with the inspection rights.
This is clause 7.3, and it gives the employer's team, so the engineer and their people, just massive reach. They get full access to the whole site during working hours.
Okay, that makes sense.
But here's the kicker. They also get access to all places where natural materials are being obtained.
Whoa, hang on. You mean?
All places.
So an engineer could theoretically demand to go inspect the quarry 50 miles away that's providing the gravel. Is that real, or is that just leverage?
It's both. And that's the power of FIDI. They have the absolute legal right to show up at that quarry. The fact that they can is the leverage that ensures the contractor is sourcing compliant materials.
And when they do these inspections, what are they allowed to do?
Pretty much anything related to quality. They can examine, inspect, measure, test. They can check the progress of manufacturing. And importantly, they can make records, photos, videos, you name it.
Creating that definitive project file.
A massive one. And of course, the contractor has to provide safe access, facilities, safety gear, all of it.
But this all leads up to what you called the linchpin of the whole system, the point where a paperwork mistake could cost millions.
The notice requirement. This is it, the single most important defensive move for a contractor.
Okay, lay that for us.
The contractor must give a formal notice to the engineer whenever work is ready for inspection. And, this is the critical part, before it is covered up, put out of sight, or packaged for transport.
So I've laid the rebar for a foundation. Before I call the concrete truck, I have to send that notice.
You have to send that notice. If you do, and the engineer doesn't show up or says they don't need to inspect, you're clear. You can pour the concrete. You've protected yourself.
But what if I forget? What if I pour the concrete and then remember I didn't send the email?
Then you are in very, very serious trouble. If the engineer instructs it, you are required to uncover the work and then reinstate and make good.
Uncover it, you mean?
Yeah.
Break up the concrete.
Break up the concrete. And here's the key. All at the contractor's risk and cost.
Wow. That seems so harsh, especially if the work underneath was actually perfect.
It is harsh, but the penalty isn't for bad quality. The penalty is for a failure of process. Without that notice, the engineer loses their only chance to verify the quality. The contract protects the process above all else.
It's a huge financial hammer for a procedural slip-up. Okay, let's shift from looking at things to formally testing them. Clause 7.4, testing.
Right, and this is about all the tests that happen before the final handover. The burden here is squarely on the contractor.
And it's a big burden. The list of things they have to provide is huge.
It's everything. Apparatus, documents, temporary electricity and water, fuel, instruments, and of course qualified staff to run the tests. The employer provides nothing.
And all that equipment has to be accurate, which brings in calibration.
Yes, everything has to be calibrated to contract standards or local laws, and you'd better have the certificates ready if the engineer asks for them. Everything must be provably accurate.
So we have another notice requirement here for the testing, but the risk seems to flip.
It does. It's a balancing act. The contractor gives notice of the test time and place. The engineer then has to give at least 72 hours notice if they plan to attend.
And if they don't give that 72-hour notice, or they just don't show up?
The contractor proceeds with the test. And this is where the contractor's schedule is protected. Those tests are deemed to have been made in the engineer's presence.
Deemed.
Which means the engineer is then also deemed to have accepted the readings as accurate.
Wow. So the tables are turned completely. A contractor forgets an email and has to demolish a foundation. An engineer misses a 72-hour deadline, and they have to accept test data they've never even seen.
That's exactly it. It becomes this high-stakes notice war. It prevents the employer from just endlessly delaying the project by not showing up to things.
Let's talk about money. The engineer can always order extra tests if they're suspicious about something, right? A variation.
They can.
What if that extra test proves the contractor's work was actually bad?
Then the contractor pays for everything. The cost of the extra test, any delay it caused, the fix for the bad work, and then the retest. It's a cascade of costs.
But if the engineer's gut feeling was wrong, and the extra test shows the work was fine all along?
Then it's on the employer. The contractor gets paid for the test as a variation, cost plus profit, and they can claim an extension of time for any delay. The costs always follow the fault.
It's meticulously designed. So let's move on to when a defect is actually found. Clause 7.5, defects and rejection.
Right. So the engineer finds a fault, they issue a notice, then the contractor can't just start fixing it.
They have to submit a plan first.
A proposal for the remedial work, yes. And this starts another clock. The engineer gets 14 days to object.
And if they don't?
If they don't respond in 14 days, the proposal is deemed to have a notice of no objection.
So the contractor isn't stuck waiting forever. They can get on with the fix.
Exactly. But if the contractor fails to submit a plan or doesn't follow the approved plan, the engineer can just reject the faulty item outright.
And what about retesting after the fix? I assume the contractor pays for that too.
Oh, absolutely. The retest is at the contractor's risk and cost. And on top of that, if the whole rejection and remedy process caused the employer any other costs, like managing delays, the contractor has to pay for those as well.
The cost just keeps multiplying. It makes getting it right the first time incredibly important.
It does, and Clause 7.6 really drives home the engineer's power. It says they can instruct remedial work at any time before the final project handover.
Even if they inspected it before and said it was fine.
Even then, if a flaw is discovered later, it's still on the contractor to fix it. This power doesn't expire until the very end.
And there's a bit about urgent work in there.
Right, for safety reasons, after an accident, for example. Normally, the contractor pays for all remedial work. The only real exception is if that urgent work was needed because of something the employer's team did.
In that case, the contractor gets their time and money back.
It's that fine-grained allocation of fault again.
Okay, let's shift gears quickly for the last two clauses. Property rights. Clause 7.7. When does the stuff on site actually become the employer's property?
It's so important for insurance and risk. The ownership of plant and materials transfers to the employer at the earliest of three possible moments.
The most obvious one being when it's delivered to the site.
Exactly. If it's on their land, it's theirs. The other two triggers are both related to payment. Essentially, once the employer has paid for an item, they own it, even if it's not on site yet.
Simple enough.
Mm.
And finally, Clause 7.8, royalties. This just cleans up who pays for outside costs.
It does. It says the contractor, unless the contract states otherwise, pays for two things. First, any royalties or rent for natural materials taken from outside the site. So if you're getting sand from a private pit, you pay the owner.
Makes sense. And the second,
Disposal costs. The contractor pays to get rid of surplus stuff from demolitions or excavations. The only exception is if the employer specifically gave them a disposal area on the site within the contract. It just ties up all the loose ends about external costs.
what an incredibly detailed framework. We've gone from the very definition of good practice all the way to the penalty for missing that 72-hour deadline. It's just a meticulously documented system.
It is. The entire thing is built on process, on compliance, and on very clear, very strict financial consequences. It's not about trust. It's about proof. Can you prove you followed every single rule?
So what this really means for you, if you're anywhere near one of these projects, is that the true art isn't just in the physical construction. It's in managing the paperwork, hitting those notice windows, and avoiding that terrifying risk of having to, pay to uncover a perfectly good piece of work because you missed an email.
And that leads to a really interesting final thought. Given how much power the engineer has to inspect, but also how the rules can deem a test as passed if the engineer misses a deadline, it raises a question. How much is a smart contractor relying on the actual competence of the employer's team versus how much are they relying on just the rules of the contract to manage their own risk? If you know the rules let you proceed, if the inspector is a no-show, that rule becomes a powerful shield against delays, not just a tool for quality. Something for you to think about.